Order, order. I call to order this evidence session of the Defence Committee on the Armed Forces Covenant Inquiry. And for today's first panel, we have in person Colonel James Phillips, who is the Veterans Commissioner for Wales. And also in a hybrid format, we've got online Lieutenant Colonel retired Susie Hamilton, who is the Scottish Veterans Commissioner. And we also have with us David Johnstone, who is the Northern Ireland's Veterans Commissioner. And a warm welcome to all three of your good selves, and thank you for your service to our armed forces community. Let me just get things rolling with regards to the covenant in the devolved administrations. In your opinion, how well is the covenant serving the armed forces community? If we start off with yourself, Colonel James, before we move on.
Thank you. I think if I take Wales as my area of expertise, the covenant at the strategic level, so Welsh Government, is well understood, and there is a commitment in terms of policy, engagement, but not necessarily resource, and I think that's probably common across the United Kingdom. But of course, I think as you filter down the layers of government, at local government there are champions, there is an understanding of the covenant, but it's discretionary, really, although there's due regard in some areas. What does due regard mean? It's not really being tested. And it's very dependent on personalities in the champion roles within local government and within the NHS and other statutory bodies. And it depends really on their interest. It's never a single role. It's a secondary duty for those people, whether the elected official in the champion role or the official in that role. But in Wales, we're quite lucky because in the local authorities, particularly, we have the Armed Forces Liaison Officers. There's 7 of those that sort of map to the regions that are the NHS regions, which follow the traditional sort of county structure of Wales. And those signpost and advocate and train in the covenant within their regions. So that is an area, I think, of best practice where it works well. But I think the other aspect is the veteran community. 80% of veterans left service before the covenant came into place, so their understanding of the covenant is immature in some regards, and so they read the covenant, which is a promise between the nation and themselves for the service they've done, but don't really understand what that means when they see prioritisation for service-related injuries. What does prioritisation mean within an NHS in Wales, which is fundamentally broken at the moment? So there's various areas there where the covenant is open to interpretation, and so it lacks teeth to really ensure that our service population and the armed forces community in general are looked after in the way that perhaps we would like.
Thank you very much, Colonel Phillips. I will come on to best practice and what's going well and not so well, but I just wanted to get a brief introduction as to how well you think the covenant is serving our community. Lieutenant Commander Hamilton.
Thank you. Having worked in the veterans arena in Scotland for about 17 years, I've seen that there's definitely, undoubtedly been improvement in services and support for veterans over that time. I wouldn't necessarily say that the covenant legislation alone has driven this, but things are definitely better for the veteran community than they were at the start of the century. It's very inconsistent, and there are patchy areas. And I think as James has referred to, there's a big difference between awareness at the policy making level and at the frontline delivery level, and also in levels of awareness in the veteran community. So there's a lot of misunderstanding about what the covenant actually means to veterans and their families.
Thank you very much. Mr. Johnson?
Yes, thank you, Chair. As the members are probably aware, I am only in post from the 1st of January, so still coming to grips with the details of things like the Armed Forces Covenant. If I could just comment, I think that there is this difference between perception and reality. Obviously, those who perhaps know the detail of the covenant and what it's intended to achieve, but how well do the veterans on the ground and how well do employers and various other stakeholders understand the reality of it? So I think that's where I can see arriving at this relatively recently. Within Northern Ireland, of course, we have a slightly additional complication because of the landscape in Northern Ireland. So I think in some ways, in terms of the general overview, it is working. It does have benefits for veterans, but there is still work to do.
Good. I will be coming back onto that. But I just want to now ask your good selves examples of good practice, but also if there are any particular issues that you are facing in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland respectively. Good practice examples which could perhaps be emulated in other parts of the UK. So examples of good practice as well as particular issues that require special attention. If we start off with Lieutenant Commander Hamilton, please.
Thank you. Some examples of good practice have also highlighted areas of challenge, but we have had some good practice in the health sphere in Scotland. In terms of mental health, there are Veterans First Point organisations in a number of health boards, and 6 health boards in Scotland, which are co-funded by the Health Board and the Scottish Government. And as well as providing clinical support, they provide much needed peer support and help during the waiting period for clinical treatment, which has the effect of having much better outcomes for the veterans involved. But this has also highlighted a challenge, and the NHS Lothian has decided to stop funding their Veterans First Point. And despite the Covenant legislation that is going to happen, the Covenant will not be able to stop that happening. And that's to the great anguish of veterans in Lothian. Mm-hmm. And it also highlights that we're not recording data and metrics in a way that's really going to tell us what effect these services have. So I suspect the effect will be maybe more veterans accessing crisis mental health teams, more attendances at A&E, possibly even losing tenancies because of mental health needs. None of that will be measured or captured. So the difference that's being made by the Veterans First Point, or the lack of it, isn't going to be highlighted. So we really need to be better at measuring some of these impacts, so we can really see where resources have to be focused. Resources, as we know, are extremely stretched at the moment for the whole community, for everybody. Other positive examples, there's been some really good collaboration in Glasgow with Greater Glasgow and Clyde Health Board, the City Council, SAFA and DMWS, so 2 big charities, and that's providing a really holistic service of support from everything from housing to health and social support. And they are actually collecting some good data. So we should actually see from that some really good data and see whether that's something that can be replicated and we can trust that data. But seeing that really good collaboration, it is really effective. And I'd like to highlight that. I'd also highlight the work done by Skills Development Scotland, so Scotland's skills agency, and the Scottish Credit and Qualifications Framework, which has translated military qualifications onto the Scottish framework, which had not been previously. They are automatically on the England and Wales framework, but they're not in the Scottish framework. And also created a tool where service leavers, service people can translate some of their meta skills into language that employers would understand and language that can be used on their CV. It's called the Skills Discovery Tool on the My World of Work website, and it really is genuinely a good piece of work, and I think it's something that should be replicated and could be replicated across the UK.
Good. Right.
So those are just a few examples.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. And in fact, it's good that you touched upon mental health issues as well, because Lieutenant General Sir Nick Pope, when he was giving evidence to our committee, he mentioned that the support in terms of special educational needs and disabilities, certain things that would be available in England when the family moved to, for example, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, that support in that particular format wasn't available because of the lack of relevant EHCP plans. So That's where I think there is some differences in terms of policy. But Mr. Johnson, perhaps you could touch upon that as well as explaining about the good practices as well.
Yes, indeed. So certainly in Northern Ireland, we have very much a bottom-up service rather than a top-down when it comes to some of the issues around the Armed Forces Covenant. On the ground, on the cold face, as I call it, we actually have very good delivery of health services to veterans, particularly in the area of mental health and recovery from physical injuries. Paul Byrne from the Veterans Welfare Service, his body, along with the various third sector charity organisation, definitely means that we're in a good place. And there are multiple examples I could give of people who have managed to reach out or have been signposted to the VWS and then very quickly have accessed the medical care, the medical support that they need. So I think there's certainly a very positive reality for veterans on the ground. Could it be improved? Of course, yes. Our own health service in Northern Ireland here probably has the longest waiting lists of anywhere in the United Kingdom. So sometimes veterans have the perception that they're not receiving care if they go the normal route through the health service. But really everyone in Northern Ireland suffers from our current health service challenges. So positive in terms of veterans reaching the medical services they need. If I give one example of perhaps a negative or a deficit, I was in with a statutory body yesterday. They indicated a veteran had spent 40 weeks living in his car in recent years, given just some personal challenge he had around his family. That was certainly a surprise to me and a shock to me that in 2025 we have a veteran who feels he's no other choice, no other option but to live in his car. So certainly for him, the Armed Forces Covenant wasn't really impacting his life. So that's just an example of a negative, and I'm sure that's replicated in other parts of the UK as well.
Yeah, that was a particularly shocking example for all of us to learn across the UK. Colonel Phillips?
Yes, thank you, Chair. I think in terms of what Wales does well, I'd sort of highlight three areas. One is wider than Welsh Government, but it's sort of from Welsh Government and society as a whole is a recognition that the armed forces get. There's still a very strong community feel in Wales. The veteran population in Wales is 4.5% of the civil population, as opposed to sort of being 3.8% in England. So there's a higher density of veterans and service people who've experienced service or know a service person within the community. And that, obviously, that value of service is still strong. That's supported by a number of good networks, again from Welsh Government down with their Armed Forces Expert Group, which brings in key stakeholders from the single services, the charities, NHS and statutory bodies in terms of quarterly sort of meetings. But below that's a number of working groups which look at core areas such as housing, employment, education and training, and health and well-being, and bring in the subject matter experts. And then at the community level, there are community covenant forums in health, but also in wider local government areas, which are supported by the champions and by the Armed Forces liaison officers. And I come on to them as a real win in Wales. There are, as I said, 7 Armed Forces liaison officers. They sit in clusters of local authorities, so each will support 2 or 3 local authorities. And they work to train staff on the Covenant in due regard, to signpost veterans in their areas to services and support that's available, and to work in coordinating effect from the third sector and statutory bodies to ensure that there is relatively joined up support for veterans, but not just veterans, because they cover the armed forces community as a whole. So they work with schools and with schools liaison officers that are also supported in Wales to support service children. And then also underneath that is the Armed Forces Covenant Fund Trust, which is the primary sort of MOD funding mechanism for service and support for welfare and well-being for veterans. Supports something called the V4P, the Veterans, People, Places, pathway. There's another P in there, can't quite remember what that one is, but V4P anyway, which brings together, is funded to bring together organisations that support the veteran community and deliver well-being. Well, actually, that's most of the things that are provided for veterans, whether it be in the employment space, the housing space, the health space, are supporting well-being. And they have 8 funded projects, which are funded by the Armed Forces Covenant Fund Trust, but they have 100 stakeholders that join virtual meetings and engage. And I think that's where we benefit in Wales, is that the geographic scale of Wales is such that it's parochial. People know each other. So if a veteran falls into the network, they might not fall into the right place in the network, but they can be signposted to it. What don't we do quite so well? There's a growing gap between the health service in Wales and in England, and as my colleague David said, when the national health service in a nation is struggling, it's very difficult to provide priority for service-related injuries. But also as a perception, as David said, from the veteran community, that they're not valued and not being supported for their service-related injuries, which might be difficult to relate to service. So you're asking a clinician to decide that a veteran who did national service perhaps and needs knee replacement in his 70s or 80s, is that related to his service of 2 years in the military, or is that just degradation? How do you prioritise him over the wider civilian population? Relatively easy to do with a young service leaver who's got an amputated leg, and you can see that he comes with his medical documents and can move into the transition into health service. I'm not saying that's faultless, because there are issues in terms of transference of data, but it's easier to demonstrate that linkage to service. But it's difficult, and I think that's where the covenant and the due regard piece in health is problematic, because it's that prioritisation. What does that actually mean? Where do you fit into a waiting list that's already full, with people waiting 2 years for elective surgery? So that in itself is difficult. The other area, 2 areas I'd quickly cover. One is housing, social housing. Again, it's difficult for everyone in Wales. There's a shortage of social and affordable housing. But when you hear about veterans who are living in their car, and we have that in Wales as well, and then you try and put them into crisis housing, which is full of people who have addiction problems, have criminal tendencies perhaps, and you take a veteran who's used to a very disciplined service and lifestyle, you put them into that, it doesn't work well, which is why veterans prefer to go into veteran-specific crisis units that support them and their needs. They're with other veterans, and they are not in a chaotic lifestyle, and they're not living alongside people who challenge them. And
very briefly, please.
Sorry, so that's the housing one, and the other one is veterans in the justice system. In England, you have something called Opnova, which provides a holistic wrap for veterans and justice. We don't have that in Wales.
We will be coming on to the veterans issues very shortly. But very briefly, if I may, Mr. Johnson, you alluded earlier to the unique context of Northern Ireland, and in particular, David McLaughlin, the Director for Defence Healthcare at the MOD, mentioned that the legal interpretation of the Good Friday Agreement, as well as the Armed Forces Act 2021, that actually complicated the implementation of the covenant. Now, so with regards to that unique context, how much do you think that affects the application of the covenant, not just for veterans, but more widely within Northern Ireland?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. So I think this allows me to expand a bit on my comment around bottom-up versus top-down. So we do not have a top-down delivery of the Armed Forces Covenant due to the current political makeup, particularly at Stormont, where the largest party just refuses to acknowledge and engage with anything around the Armed Forces Covenant. Areas like housing are, of course, a devolved matter in Northern Ireland. So where the executive is not willing to engage, then you immediately have a problem of that top-down delivery. Now, as I said, there is certainly really good work on the ground from the bottom up in terms of what's happening to veterans, but the perception and I think recognition is a significant point. Veterans really want to be recognised for their service. So when like Belfast City Council, for instance, recently reversed a vote to implement the Armed Forces Covenant, that was very disappointing and very frustrating to veterans, certainly in Belfast City. I think if it was probably described as the current situation in Stormont is around receive mode, emails come in regarding the Armed Forces Covenant, they are confirmed as received, and then that's as far as it goes, and nothing actually happens. How we go about addressing that, I think it's education. It's pointing out that the Armed Forces Covenant is not about advantage to veterans. It's about ensuring that there's no disadvantage, and therefore no one across the United Kingdom should feel threatened by the fact that veterans are being given equality around this issue. So that for me, I think, is important as we move forward.
Thank you very much. You touched upon veterans issues, and I want to move on to the Covenant and veterans, and if I can please bring in Alex Baker.
Thank you, Chair. So you have answered, given us a really comprehensive answer on how you think the Covenant is serving our veterans community. I will come back to veterans, but I just want to ask you one question, just to cover off a piece we're interested in. You are all people that have served, got distinguished records of service yourselves, and you will have exposure to our serving armed forces community. Have you got any thoughts on how well the Covenant is serving our current serving population? James?
Shall I start? Yeah. Thank you. I think, as Susie said in her opening piece, there's been significant improvement over the last 10 years of support for the wider armed forces community. I guess it sort of grew with Afghanistan and seeing the sort of casualties coming home from that, and the growth of sort of charities like Help for Heroes, and the nascent armed forces covenant that was developed then. And I think as we've said all the way through, there's a good understanding by organisations that support the armed forces community of the Covenant. But the problem is that we outsource so many of our support services now for the armed forces community. So, there are no military hospitals. Families are dealt with within the NHS. Your second line medical support as a service person in the UK is delivered through the NHS, and so the lines are blurred as to where service is provided by the MOD and where it's provided by other agencies. And I've seen that, particularly in a case at the moment, the service family in Cardiff, where a special forces soldier, so you would have thought someone who received the very highest levels of support and care for the service they've done, is sick at home with severe mental and physical health condition, and has sort of fallen through the gaps and is about to be medically discharged from the service, and there isn't really a holistic care package around that family. It was brought to my attention as a Veterans Commissioner, and I engaged with the chain of command and with ministers, and now the system's kicking in. But I think as we abrogate more responsibility from the MOD to civilian agencies, the chain of command has less visibility of what is happening for its people and less control over that. And therefore that duty of care that is provided from within defence is less effective. And I think that's something that we've probably seen, unfortunately, recently in terms of some of the discipline and some of the sexual assaults and attacks that are taking place within the armed forces, where we are transitioning from a service delivery model which was the chain of command completely to something which is now far more distributed, with people encouraging people to live out in the community, taking people off the patch, and there is less ability for the chain of command to deliver that support that it always used to.
Thank you. Can I ask David to come in next?
Yes, and in terms of that, I think it would be specifically around the transition of existing armed forces members as they leave. I think the areas that would come to my attention would be around schools. So someone who is perhaps either posted back into the province or is transitioning. There is a real challenge around having an address in an area that allows them to send their children to the school of their choice. And there's certainly a challenge around that. And then certainly housing. Again, either someone moving back to the province on a posting or having just left, therefore transitioning. How do they achieve enough points to allow them to access the housing that they need if they're going into the provided housing from council or the housing executive here in Northern Ireland. So I think those two areas would be areas where existing serving members and those who are just leaving have some other observations around transition. Perhaps that will come up later on in the conversation, but hopefully that's helpful.
Thank you. And Susie?
So I've heard from Sarah's families, and the big issues that have come up there have been childcare. So both in Murray and in the Helmsbury area, there are real shortages of childcare, which limits spousal employment, which these days really is a financial imperative for families to have two working partners. Also, has already been alluded to, assessments of children with additional support needs, ASN in Scotland, and quite often with mobile families, the assessments don't even get done by the time they're moving on again. So the children are not getting the support they need. And charities are stepping in to fund private assessments to try and speed that up. And then I think we've already mentioned transition a couple of times. That is still very patchy, and in areas such as through life skills, which is part of the new transition approach, which is supposed to be incorporated into service life. More awareness about housing, more awareness about finances. We're not really seeing the evidence of that, and I don't really see that that's being measured either. So what life skills are being delivered, how that's actually being, the effectiveness of that being measured. But certainly I hear from providers that people are leaving the armed forces without really understanding housing very well, without having made provision, without really understanding their pension or understanding their finances. And I'm sure that's solvable, and that really would also help.
Thank you very much for those reflections. It's really useful and correlates very much with a lot of the evidence that we've had in this inquiry so far. So bringing you back to veterans now, how could support for veterans be made more consistent across the whole United Kingdom? Who wants to start? Okay, David.
I'm happy to go with that initially, if that's okay, Chair. Just following on from what Susie said there, I think it's absolutely right. I think transition is an area that could be improved, and I think would have a significant impact then on various challenges that come after that, specifically around perhaps staying in touch with veterans just after they have left. And certainly I've had many examples of people who felt, particularly if they've only served for a couple of years, they literally have a couple of hours of an interview and then they're out of the system on their own. And it might be 3 years, 5 years, 10 years down the line. There's then perhaps a mental health challenge, which then has to be dealt with by the system. So as resources and time are then put into trying to fix a broken veteran. Whereas if we had a better transition period, staying in touch with that veteran, it may actually alleviate and prevent some further challenges that happen down the line. So if I summarise that, prevention perhaps is better than cure. There's so much focus on the cure of broken veterans, but let's through transition see if we can stop veterans becoming more broken.
So just to come back to you on that point, how do you deliver transition consistently? How would you do it if you were in charge of doing that?
So certainly there is a frustration among veterans that when they do leave that transition, there are so many different points of contact, telephone numbers, statutory bodies. They're almost confused of where to go. I think one thing that would help, I'm not sure how my colleagues Susie and James feel about this, but if there was initially perhaps that one point of contact for a veteran as they're leaving or after they've just left, that they could, meet or have a phone number or that point of contact. I think it would take away the confusion and streamline the delivery of services.
James or Susie, who wants to go next?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I agree that single point of contact is important. The veteran space and the transition space is very cluttered and complicated, and we, as commissioners, were discussing that only this morning. There are new initiatives. A new initiative announced by Minister Carnes yesterday, which supports other initiatives that are in place. We've got a new provider of a career transitions program at the moment, after having had the same contractor providing it for 10 years or so, and that's still, we're looking to see how that's bedding in. There's evidence on the ground that there are some teething problems with that from veterans in terms of support, and there's always a push to move transition further to the left, but that's, you're putting the onus then on the serving military to provide that education and transition when they have busy and heated programs anyway, and their focus should be on delivery of military effect. And so, it's that problem of where the responsibilities lie and fall, and how do you take a young Lance Corporal who's looking at his career progression and wants to go into his career courses and is interested in operations and training, and tell him he has to sit in a lecture on housing or financial planning when he's not even thinking about leaving the armed forces. But then maybe the next day he badly breaks his leg and is on a journey which is out of the armed forces. It's very difficult, and we tend to forget the veteran and the individual in these pathways. And some of those veterans, and David spoke about one who would be 5 or 6 years down the line. They are not the easiest people to trace and to keep track of and to log. Some of them are leading chaotic lives by that stage, and it's very difficult to find them and to provide them the services that they require. So it tends to be when they're in crisis that they become, we notice that they're there and they ask for help.
Susie?
I think at this point I'd like to emphasise that most veterans thrive and do really well and are contributing to society. So we're actually talking about the support and services for a minority of veterans. But I think that there's no real mechanism for public bodies to be held accountable for their covenant actions. There's no real reporting or scrutiny. So I think if we want to have consistent services, then a mechanism to have accountability that can be scrutinised for all public bodies would be really helpful in bringing in that consistency.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ian.
Thank you. I think you've answered a lot about the transition part of what I was going to ask, but what specifically would you like to see in the covenant, given that the Armed Forces Minister has said that he wants to put it fully into law? What would you want to see in the new fully into law covenant, if you like, that would help specifically place a duty on organisations to help serving personnel when they leave into civilian life?
I can start if you...
James,
we have due regard in a certain number of areas, housing, health, training, but education. But that's untested. I don't, what does that due regard mean? There's a low level of proof, I think, in terms of that. And so I think if we look at expanding that due regard function, I don't think that is enough in itself. And I think there should be a further stage which, brings the rule of law, it gives more weight to the covenant. You have here 3 commissioners who are not, I'm not legislative. I have no real teeth. I have, the power of personality in the name of commissioner to allow me to engage with public bodies and to advocate on behalf of veterans, but I don't have any legal clout to that. If I write to a public body, they don't have to respond. They do it out of the normal FOI and sort of Freedom of Information Acts. I don't have any real teeth, so I'd ask that the commissioners were brought into that and were given more of a role of holding people to account. I would ask that England had a Veterans Commissioner, and the government's looking at bringing in an Armed Forces Commissioner, but that's not to look after veterans. So there's no one doing our jobs for England. I would argue you probably need 4 to cover England to be able to do it with, in the way that we're able to do it for our nations. But there is no Veterans Commission on the horizon. There was one with the last government. I think that's been conflated with the Armed Forces Commissioner, but it doesn't. But if you look at the Armed Forces Commissioner role, it doesn't deal with veterans. So veterans in England don't have that same sort of support that our veterans might enjoy from our positions. I'm sure the others will cover very similar areas.
Thank you. Susie?
Yes, so as I've just referred to, I think bodies respond to what they're measured on. So there needs to be a formal measurement process and accountability for covenant responsibilities. And I think it would also be helpful to have national standards. So the guidance provided by the MOD is helpful guidance. It gives good examples, but the example I use, the Veterans First Point, is one of the examples in the guidance, and yet a health board is closing theirs. And that's not really very effective. So having national standards that are very clear, that we have these in lots of other areas like health and social care. So having national standards that both the veteran community can understand and the providers can understand, and they will be used by the existing ombudsman, such as the Scottish Public Services Ombudsman, and they can be referred to, and that will help to really embed awareness of the covenant and following that due regard, and embed that so that there's real use of that right down to the public facing level for all of our veterans.
Thank you, David.
Yes, I think there's 2 areas I'll mention briefly. One is financial services. I think there could be more in the covenant to understand the mobility and gaps in credit history that veterans and their families experience. My personal background in businesses and property, and I know that some veterans struggle to meet mortgage requirements in terms of the analysis of their suitability for a mortgage. So perhaps there could be something included that ensures that the financial institutions address that disparity when it comes to members of the armed forces applying for mortgages. The other thing I'll mention is justice. I think there could well be a better joining up of veterans who are in the criminal justice system, that they can identify and are connected with support mechanisms better. I think that's something that could also be included. So they're just two points I can think of.
And quickly, just within your work, how involved are you with the third sector and charities? How important are they within the transition period of leaving the forces to becoming a veteran? What are your what would you say about the third sector and their involvement? Susie, do you want to go first?
Yes, and I'll provide my somewhat biased views. I've come from working in the veterans third sector for quite a long period of time. The third sector providers are probably essential. They're the experts in a lot of these areas, and they can also provide a value-added service. They are numerous, and that can cause difficulties because it's difficult for veterans and families to navigate which is the correct approach. And the key to that is to have really close collaboration and working in consortia, as one that James referred to earlier, such as VPPP. We also have the Unforgotten Forces in Scotland, which is a consortium for older veterans working together who can make referrals to other organisations. The third sector should not be replacing statutory provision. That is absolutely essential. So I think we're thinking particularly in health and housing. These are areas which are the state should provide, particularly for somebody who has suffered illness or injury as a result of their service. If the state breaks, then the state should fix them, and that should not be done or replaced by charitable service. However, I do think charities are sometimes the best placed to carry out these services, and veterans trust the third sector. The veterans trust them far more than they may trust other statutory provision, and also that the quality can often be much higher. And I know from my experience of homeless services for veterans, the ones provided by the third sector don't look anything like a council provided homeless shelter. They are completely different things, and I think the outcomes are probably much better for the veterans in the charitable ones. So it's essential that they work together, and that we've seen good examples of statutory funding for charities who are then carrying out the delivery, and I think that's a good model that can work, as long as there is a clear path for the veterans to access it.
I think you've answered that for your colleagues as well, so I know we're short for time, and that's a really good answer, and thank you very much. I do know they do valuable work. Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Mike Martin, please.
Thanks, Chair, and thank you all very much for coming with your answers. I'm interested in the private sector. So you've painted a picture of kind of extreme variability in between, different devolved nations and different service providers in the government sector. But in the private sector, that must be even more extreme, one imagines. Could you give me a brief, a couple of examples of the good and the bad of what you've seen with service personnel and veterans and their interactions with the private sector? And specifically, is there, we're about to be rewriting some of the law in this area, or the government is about to be rewriting some of the law in this area. Are there bits that should form that legislation? Are there duties that we should impose on the private sector in order to make sure that some of that variability in the private sector is reduced and there is a more standard response to the Armed Forces Covenant from the private sector? Perhaps if I could ask you, David, to go first.
Yes, but just ask the member, you're referring with private sector in terms of business as opposed to the third sector charity. Yeah. Okay. One of the, and again, I don't want to keep highlighting the differences in Northern Ireland because there are many similarities. And again, I agree with Susie that there are many veterans who leave the armed forces and go on to make a tremendous contribution to society. It's exactly the same in Northern Ireland. One challenge we do have is that while we have around 40 organisations that have signed up to the Armed Forces Covenant, many of them do not want to make that public, and therefore it's a sort of a private hand in the air to support what the Armed Forces Covenant stands for, but there is sort of no public championing of that, and I think that in itself then again leads to environment where veterans don't feel that they've been recognised when it comes to engaging with the private sector. You also have, I suppose, the overarching legacy issue, and I would hopefully like to just comment on that before the session finishes, if there's not a question on it directly. But again, some people who have served, when they do go to the private sector, they don't want to acknowledge their service just for security concerns in some cases. So I suppose that's probably like most places in the UK, there are some companies, private companies are very pro veterans and are very happy to involve them, recognise the skills and the experience they bring. But then there are others who either aren't aware, and then you have those who'd be very opposed to what the veteran stands for in Northern Ireland.
Thank you very much. And David, is there anything we can do, or the government can do, and it's re-legislating in that area? Or do you think, or is Northern Ireland a particularly just special case for obvious reasons?
It's a really good question. I think the passage of time will help, but I do have to say that the recent legacy cases have not helped the overall environment for veterans, and I wouldn't be doing my job as a Veterans Commissioner if I didn't highlight that to the inquiry today, that when we're talking about health and education and private sector, for some veterans, not just in Northern Ireland but in GB, they're not really concerned about that currently. They're concerned about whether they're going to be brought back to court 30, 50 years later. And even though they operated under military law, rules of engagement, were sent there by the government, they now find themselves looking down the barrel of a potential prosecution for murder. That for many veterans is very much in their mind, more so than worrying about sort of private sector and things like that.
Okay, yeah.
Mike, if I...
Point made. Thank you very much. Yeah, sure.
I could just say something quick. I think, like many things, it's the cluttered battle space that we work in. There is already organisation, MOD organisations out there. The RFCA and the Defence Relationship Management, which is part of the RFCA, that work, with the private sector for two reasons. One is for reservist release and enabling them to support reservists, but the other is for employment. And they run the employment recognition schemes, the bronze, silver and gold, and the covenant signings, very active across Wales, and I think England. I can't speak for the other two devolved nations. So we have these things in force. We have these organisations there who are doing it, but then we have initiatives such as Prosper with Mission Community, which was funded with 2 million to deliver something very similar. And these initiatives need to be coordinated. The effect needs to be coordinated to maximise it and deliver best for our people.
Okay, and then so is there any piece of legislation is there a quick fix? Is there a duty that can be imposed? Is it right to impose a duty on the private sector to, make sure that the contributions of our service personnel and veterans are recognised? And genuine.
I know it's a good question. I'm not a legislator, and
But based on your experience of what you've seen, the interactions between service personnel and the private sector, or
that's difficult to do with the private sector. I think we go probably as far as we do with the RSCA and the Defence Relationship Management. What we don't do is leverage those awards, those companies that have signed up, and there's many, over sort of 500, I think, across Wales, some of them public bodies as well. They fill out the tick sheet, they achieve a certain level of standard to become a gold member of the Employment Recognition Scheme, but do we then harness that and use that and say, well, you're a gold member, if you want to keep your gold membership, there's certain things you have to do, and I'm not sure we do that.
Okay, that's interesting, thank you very much. And Susie, just to finish off.
Yes, I agree with James. The employee recognition scheme can be really effective, and I think probably particularly the gold award holders need to be held more strongly to account because they are supposed to be real champions in their areas. The touch points for veterans, I guess, are employment and financial services. We've talked a bit about financial services. I think there's definitely scope to expand the covenant to cover that, to remove disadvantage. In employment, it's a bit more tricky, but certainly raising awareness, particularly of small, medium-sized enterprises, because a lot of the big employers are now really do understand the benefits of employing veterans. Yep. And spousal employment would be the big one for me, because spouses' CVs look very different to normal CVs, shall we say. Yep. And there should certainly be something, I think, to force employers really to look past that very strange CV and look beyond it and consider employing armed forces spouses, and maybe also consider more flexible or hybrid employment for armed forces spouses, because again, that's a huge talent pool, huge resource of talent that is definitely underused because of kind of perceptions and because of these difficulties.
Thank you. That's a great point. Thank you all.
Thank you very much. Kelvin Bailey, please.
Thank you. Looking now at the future of the covenant, do you think the legal duty should be extended to cover the devolved administrations? And could you elaborate perhaps on the seams between the nations, the seams of the UK, and how those impact veterans choosing where to retire to?
Looks like I'm on point. It goes back. I mean, if you're talking about bringing, in due regard, I bring back to the question: what does due regard mean? How do you, where are you setting that bar for due regard? And it depends on how high you set that bar as to how effective due regard is. And I'm not aware of any case where that due regard has been tested yet. Certainly not in Wales. It may have been in some other part of the United Kingdom, but I think you need to be probably stricter in terms of applying that due regard and defining what it means legally. I think in Wales, the Welsh government and local governments pretty much, it's as if they are legally bound by the covenant. They are pretty compliant. I think what we saw when due regard came in was a forcing function in those areas of housing, education and health, that those bodies refreshed their understanding and training of the covenant, so it was useful in that regard. And I suspect by doing that across the devolved nations, it would ensure that they did a bit of housekeeping and looked at in making sure that their application of due regard for covenant was comprehensive. So I think it would be useful in that function. But I think it's the pivotal point is what bar do you set for due regard to make sure that people are achieving the required standard.
Okay, thank you. David, Susie?
Yeah, I'll just pop in there next. In an ideal world, yes, there should be a greater onus on the devolved administrations to implement and show that due regard that James has just mentioned, particularly in Northern Ireland, where housing and health is a devolved matter, and therefore it would be very helpful if the devolved administration was therefore required to implement the Armed Forces Covenant. Again, I don't need to highlight the fact that we're not there yet in Northern Ireland, and therefore it does create a difficulty in terms of the whole conversation around the devolved assembly. But in an ideal world, yes, I think there should be the devolved administration should be put under more pressure to implement, and also some mechanisms where if they don't, like what is the penalty, or if they don't, how can services still be delivered to veterans? There would be the 2 points I'd make on that.
Thank you. Susie?
Yes, I broadly agree with my colleagues. I think the current administration have been trying to do things for veterans, but it's not about maybe trying to force them to change, but it's about having more resources, and if there's legal accountability, that might actually help governments, devolved administrations, set aside centrally more resources because they will have more legal duty to do that. And I think a lot of the time it's resources that are preventing real change in some of these services, real improvements. So it might actually be helpful for the governments to have that. And also it might help. There are big differences in areas between, particularly in England and Scotland, but also Scotland and Wales. So that those cross-border differences of Op Courage in England doesn't exist in Scotland, Op Nova, we don't really have Op Nova in Scotland, and then we don't have AFLOs like have in Wales. So having all those different approaches that's confusing and difficult for veterans when it comes to choosing where they want to live. So I think that could help.
Okay, thank you. And just to pick up on David's point then, David, you identified perhaps that that there should be certain extensions of the covenant if it was to cover legal duty. You mentioned housing. Can I also ask for a view on social care from any of you, and maybe any other areas that you think should be considered? James?
Yes, I mean, social care is a huge area of concern really now. Is resources in the local authorities are really challenging, and certainly in Wales, our veteran population, 50% are over 65, 20% are over 85, and so it's social care for older veterans, but also for families in crisis or in need is an area where I think we should look at covenant extension. Because I think it's an area at the moment that's lacking, and it's an area where we see real need in terms of the veteran population that are in crisis. And as Susie alluded to earlier, 90% of veterans transition and are effective members of our society as we see here, but it's that minority that are in crisis that really do rely on those services, and their lifestyle and their while they have been serving means that they're difficult. It's difficult to understand their circumstances, and they don't necessarily have that history, which a lot of social services like to see to prove their need.
Thank you. Susie, David, any other points?
Yes, I'd just like to say that I think in a lot of areas of social care, there isn't really clear evidence of a difference in need between the veteran community and the civilian population. So I'm not sure how much benefit would be gained by legislating for that. Maybe in more specific areas such as supported housing and possibly with separated families, perhaps in the domestic violence sphere, which again, we're talking about quite small numbers, and I'm not sure it's always necessary to have very specific provision. But for the older population of veterans, which is an ageing population, I think their needs are very, very similar to the older population of our country.
Brilliant, thanks very much. So just noting, as I hand back to you, Mr. Chair, that there is no representative of the largest populations within our country in London and Birmingham. I'll hand you back to the Chair.
Thank you very much. I'm very, very grateful to your good selves for taking time out to give evidence to our inquiry on the Armed Forces Covenant. And I will now be briefly suspending the session in order to set up for our second panel. Order. Order. I call to order today's hearing on the Defence Committee's inquiry into the Armed Forces Covenant, and it is a pleasure to warmly welcome 4 of our guests who will be giving evidence today. First of all, Councillor Liz Burnett, who is a presiding member of the Welsh Local Government Association, who is participating virtually. It is also wonderful to welcome within the committee room Mike Callaghan, who is the policy manager of the communities team at the Convention of Scottish Local Authorities. And also we have with us Kate Davies, Director for Health and Justice for the Armed Forces and Sexual Assault Services Commissioning at NHS England. And we also have with us Councillor Gillian Ford, the Deputy Chair of the Community Wellbeing Board at the LGA, the Local Government Association. Thank you so much for taking out your time to give evidence to the Defence Committee. And without further ado, I will ask my colleague Alex Baker.
So the reason we're doing this inquiry is because obviously this government is committed to put the covenant into law, but obviously the covenant already has, there is a legal duty around the covenant as it stands, and so we're really interested in what your experiences have been of delivering the legal duty under the existing covenant, and we'd be really interested in you touching on the guidance given from central government to your organisation and the kind of training that your organisations do for frontline staff. Who would like to go first? Mike, would you be up for starting?
Thanks very much, Ms Baker. First of all, thanks very much for the opportunity to come here this morning on behalf of the Convention of Scottish Local Authorities, COSLA, to provide evidence at this session. Reflecting upon the Armed Forces Covenant, Armed Forces Covenant, as many of you know, it's been delivered on a voluntary basis for quite a number of years in Scotland since 2011. It's also been delivered in a very positive way by all our member councils across Scotland in terms of its wider implementation, particularly housing, education and health and wellbeing related services. We've obviously now got it's statutory underpinned with due to regard to the Armed Forces Covenant, and that work continues to be built upon. The guidance that was provided by the MOD in conjunction with central government was very useful. It highlights some, I'm glad to see, some good practice in Scotland as part of it, which was helpful. In terms of actual experience of the Armed Forces Covenant, some really excellent work going on across Scottish local authorities. I would say particularly in some of the areas where we've got large presence of armed forces communities and families that are staying, for example, in Murray. Council have got an excellent initiative which supports the armed forces services children academically and socially, which is really important for their transition, particularly if they've moved from somewhere elsewhere in the UK and enter in the Scottish education system. Argyll and Bute similarly have a service pupil advisor to support young people, as well as armed forces ambassadors in schools. And we've also got in Highland Council very proactive support from a military liaison group on how education and housing awareness training. Going to the central belt of Scotland, South Lanarkshire near Glasgow, they've got a strong commitment to the Armed Forces Covenant. They launched the new strategy last year and an oversight group for that, and they do a lot of really good positive initiatives, like, for example, guaranteed job interviews for veterans. So there's a lot of good practice going on in Scotland, but having said that, there's always room for improvement, and we always look to build upon good practice. Thank you.
Okay.
Hi everybody, nice to be here. I mean, obviously I'm answering this from an NHS England and Health perspective. I think it's a really good question because I think the Health and Social Care Act back in 2012-13 actually was quite a pivotal point at requiring the NHS to look at how we were working with our armed forces community, and that was particularly when I came into post and the NHS England looked at how then, as a new body, it was setting up for the advantage of the armed forces community in the way that we were looking at both serving personnel, veterans, reservists and their families, as well as serving and their families. And I think that was quite a key moment for us to then really look at what were those mechanisms to make that, as you say, as part of a central governance and guiding perspective. So including NHS constitution, looking at contracts, looking at what that means with particularly key contracts with the GMS, General Medical Council and Services, our services across the generic NHS. But I think one of the things that was really a learning point, that there wasn't a lot of understanding of what the Armed Forces Covenant meant on the ground. There wasn't a lot of understanding of what that meant within legislation to the NHS as a whole. And what we were finding, particularly through working with lived experience, working with our military colleagues, working with clinicians, that we actually did need to develop what we were very targeted, very important services to not only have what was then the first national partnership agreement with the military community for the MOD and Defence Medical Services in NHS England, but also then standing up and commissioning particular services, which I'm sure we'll come on to later, that are particularly there for reservists serving and their families, and it's very important to distinguish that within the legislation, and then also what that meant for, if you like, the civilian element of the armed forces community for veterans and their families, and understanding, and I know previous devolved administration commissioners have discussed this, where there were confusion and concerns about where that guidance really, what did that mean on the ground. And I think that where we went to, as well as central government, was very much to lived experience. How did that feel? How did it work? And what could we do better? And certainly we've come a long, long way. The question also about employment, and particularly in training, is really key. At the moment, with 42 integrated care boards and integrated care systems alongside local authorities and other bodies very much on a local level, are now standing up a new armed forces framework for NHS England, particularly to look at training, education, but a very clear and precise approach across the system so that we can drive out inconsistencies, but we can also particularly promote and build on that good practice. So that's quite a kind of overview, but I'm very happy to give a lot of detail on some of those actuals.
Thank you very much. Gillian.
Thank you. I'm going to start by contextualising the financial position that councils are actually in. We're facing a funding deficit of 1.9 billion, rising to 8.4 billion by the end of Phase 2 spending review. My own authority has just received an 88 million capitalisation directive from government, which would otherwise require a 66% increase in council tax. And that's to fill the gap between income and increased demand. But councils are absolutely dedicated to supporting armed forces communities through the Covenant, and we feel that that is best integrated into local networks and supported by strategic partnerships. In fact, in Havering, we are just signing with our NEL ICB the Armed Forces Covenant, and that's going to be in June when we have our Armed Forces Day, and that's going to be with all partners, and the council is going to re-sign. So that's something positive the councils are doing. We've also noticed that officers provide, with experience, that flexible support, and we're fortunate to have somebody from the armed forces as that expert within our team. Councils frequently coordinate with local charities and GPs and public agencies to maintain consistent engagement. And they report that strong local partnerships enhance the visibility and accessibility, enabling those veterans to get the support that they need. And some councils are also using digital platforms and regional forums to engage and to bridge that communication gap and standardise the messaging. However, councils face consistently challenges with inconsistent statutory guidance and little to no top-down leadership and support from central government departments, which affects the Covenant, and that's we're not getting the information from MHCLG, DFE, etc. So it's that joined up working and that feeding through. This then leads to different interpretations and inconsistent applications across the country, and creating geographical disparities. Councils request clearer national guidelines so that we can have that standardised approach to the covenant duties and reduce that ambiguity. To overcome those inconsistencies, councils currently participate in regional forums and partnership boards, and they share information on the statutory guidance where they see that working and the effective practices. And it's that collaborative approach that enhances those consistencies. And councils emphasise that open communication and knowledge sharing are crucial for effective covenant delivery, and we welcome government support in getting that messaging out.
Thank you. And Liz?
Thank you, Chair. I think that our experience actually mirrors a lot of the experiences you've already heard of here. So I think that one thing that I would like to spend my small amount of time on is the essential interaction between local government and our armed forces and veterans, in that, as was said in the earlier session, most are absolutely fine when they leave the armed forces. So you need specialised care for those people that aren't okay. And that's where, as Colonel Phillips, who spoke earlier, as our Veterans Commissioner, mentioned about the Armed Forces Liaison Officers. And in Wales, they are absolutely crucial. They are people with high levels of social and human capital that not only advocate for armed forces in terms of training within local government, but they act as advocates and they act as signposting mechanisms to services to make those services work. And in a situation where we are all short of funding at the moment, those human dialogues can make quite a difference to the outcomes of individuals. They work across with individuals, they work with organisations, but they also work within communities. The types of experiences that we see our armed forces liaison officers do is that they might collaborate with other authorities in the region to get more regional activities. That's happened in Caerphilly, and I know that Caerphilly's AFLO works with ours. In Denbighshire, they've got an employability service. Neath Port Talbot has actually got Bulldogs boxing and community activities, and that's a whole range of physical activities. In Pembrokeshire, they've got a community gallery. There's all sorts of things that are going on there. There's also a supporting services children in education programme that goes right away across Wales, which meet on a regular basis and share information. But just to end this part is, I also would like to say, we talk about our armed forces community as needing support, and yes, on times they do, but actually I would also like to mention the hugely positive benefit that we have by having armed force communities in Wales. They bring a huge amount of talent and a huge amount of support. And if I just look at some of the Afghan resettlement schemes that have currently been supported locally in my local authority, and the fact that we had veterans in our communities who have been phenomenal in providing a welcome to the Afghan refugees that have come into our country, I can't speak highly enough and give sufficient thanks to them for their participation. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Michelle Scroggin, please.
Thank you very much, Chair. We've heard that the Covenant is being delivered differently, very differently, from one area to the next, whether it's within local authorities or trusts. We're trying to get to the bottom of the reason for that. Do you think there are any examples where the Covenant is being delivered particularly well that could be emulated across the rest of the country, and where it's not doing very well? What are the reasons behind that? And what mechanisms do you have for evaluating success and spreading good practice within your organisations? I'll be interested to hear from each of you. I'll probably start with Councillor Burnett.
Thank you. I think the biggest challenge that we face is actually identifying veterans in order to support them. And I think for us, one of the big steps forward has been to include a question on whether someone has served in the armed forces in the 2021 census, and that actually gives us an idea of the size of the community within Wales and also within local government areas.
Thank you. I'll go next to Gillian, if that's okay.
Thank you. Yes, I mean, there is effective sharing of good practice. At the national level, we have regional forums, and we've also got the LGA Armed Forces Covenant Network. And these networks enable councils to exchange effective practices, learn from the challenges, and adapt solutions to local contexts. Council participating in the joint partnership boards coordinate shared actions and align services delivery strategies. However, councils report that access to these networks is fragmented and is inconsistent, which leads to that fragmented knowledge transfer where the partnerships are less established. And councils consistently request better national coordination of those frameworks and groupings and those platforms so that we can get more sharing of best practice and effective best practice. The WLGA Armed Forces Covenant Network provides an invaluable platform for councils and to connect, but further support is needed to ensure councils are aware of this. And again, that comes down to the communications and getting those messages out. In relation to delivering the measuring success, then we have councils use accountability by using community feedback. We have focus groups and partnership evaluations to measure those successes. They prioritise lived experience over rigid metrics. However, most councils lack formal performance frameworks. So again, that can be leading to those inconsistencies across the piece and the measurement of accountability. Without the standardised metrics, comparisons between regions are unreliable because you've got nothing to benchmark against. So some councils are developing performance indicators linked to strategic outcomes using data analysis, analytics rather, to track service usage and target improvements. Some councils are deliberately avoiding target-based metrics, arguing that they distort priorities and incentivise superficial successes. Instead, they focus on qualitative feedback to maintain flexibility and that responsiveness. And councils advocate for balanced evaluation frameworks that actually include both quantitative but also those qualitative measures.
Very much. And
I suppose I come from a slightly different perspective because of the work that we're doing across NHS England. I'm the director of a single armed forces team across the whole of NHS England. It's not there to do the job, obviously, of the whole of the needs across the NHS. But I think it's there because of that question that there are things that we should absolutely do once and do at scale in order to support our armed forces community and give that commitment through the covenant, but also get to what is really important, those services and that delivery on the ground. So building on that good practice, then NHS England, I mean, you've heard this term a lot, I know, within your committee, but I'm going to be kind of a little bit cheeky because the op word came originally from NHS England. It was the very first service, which was Op Courage, which was actually named by lived experience men and women in the veterans community to deliver the first nationwide mental health service, including complex PTSD and also transition and crisis intervention for our veterans and their families. But it was also connected with the way that we look at mental health services, primary care, secondary care services across families and also serving personnel. So it was really important to look at it as a whole. Also within resources, which I know is an ongoing issue, is to use those resources well and to fund at scale mental health services, but also Op Restore, which is the physical trauma services connected with another 26 clinical networks around trauma in acute trusts. Also Op Nova, which is the criminal justice system service, which again is England-wide, both pre- and post-custody, but also in prisons now for the first time, developing at scale. But ultimately, what you want also at the same time, if you like, those are the targeted elements, is what you can develop across a systems approach. So the fact that we then, as part of that, brought in the GP accreditation requirement across now all primary care clinical networks, and we're just at around 99% of that. It's taken a number of years to get to that point. The same with the Veterans Covenant Health Alliance and acute trusts. Then it's really about how do you get that two-pronged approach about absolutely targeting the services and the good delivery and evidencing them at scale. 30,000 people have gone through Op Courage since its conception in 2017. And then how do we ensure that you build that on a local level, whether that's in Havering or in Bristol or in Blackpool in London? It's really important that we look at what that means for women. What does that mean for Black and Asian men and women, particularly the Gurkha community? Some of the pathways that we've got with different ages, different conflicts. So it's knowing that specialism, but knowing it within a health community, within an NHS community, but also in collaboration with the voluntary sector. So I think the other element just around good practice is commissioning those in partnership and a requirement to do that with the voluntary sector. So Op Courage, for example, key partners in walking the wounded and combat stress. Op Restore the same with a number of charitable and lived experience co-production elements. You know, you've obviously, I could go on about this a long time, and I know there's limited time, and there's colleagues that need the time as well. But I think we started in a very low place. We started in a very inconsistent place. We've got to a pretty solid national NHS England national need and requirement, alongside of devolved administrations because of the UK population and the military. And I think it's also about evidencing it and making quite sure that people know where there are gaps and where it works and where it doesn't work. And that's absolutely important. So I think women and girls at the moment are absolutely a priority, particularly around some of the issues that we have around sexual violence and domestic violence. But not that alone. It's about brilliant women who serve and brilliant women that also need the elements that are right around, kind of the menopause. And it's the same for men, and it's the same for different communities. So yes, do it at scale. Resource it, fund it, make quite sure you have those policies and criteria, but then make quite sure you have the mechanisms through the covenant to understand how that comes and is supported on a local basis. And it doesn't matter whether you've got many hundreds of thousands, which may be in Plymouth, or you have smaller numbers that may be in a different conurbation. It needs to be equal and it needs to be consistent. And that's what we're driving in the NHS. We're certainly not all the way there, but we've certainly got a lot more than we had a few years ago.
Very much, Kate. And Mike.
Yeah, thank you. Just to build upon points that Councillor Ford's made on resources and some points that Kate's made. I mentioned my first contribution about some of what we regard as good practice in Scotland, some of the local authorities, particularly in education, housing areas, like for example, Moray Council, Argyll and Highland Council that I mentioned. And that's been supported by our various networks that we've got in Scotland. For example, for education, we've got Association of Directors of Education that publish guidance notes, and within the guidance notes they highlight examples of good practice, and as well as how children and families can be supported as part of their transition, moving into Scotland or being moving to other locations. So that's obviously helpful in that respect. In terms of measuring success, well, we tend to capture and promote the good practice case studies through COSLA, our network, but also with Alacho, who represent our chief housing officers in Scotland, and other networks. Regarding the sort of respect to measuring and monitoring progress, I think one thing that is an impediment is obviously resources across Scottish local government, and similar to in Wales and England, and that's always a significant challenge to wanting to do, promote the Armed Forces Covenant and do the sort of work that we wish to do to support these communities.
Do you feel it would be more efficient if this was led centrally then, so that we're not reinventing the wheel in every single authority?
It's an interesting question. I mean, politically, on the basis of I think the UK government, the Scottish government as a devolved administration, that would be a matter for the UK government, Scottish government. But intuitively, if you were looking at a wider commitment to the Armed Forces Covenant and more resources being, coming to Scottish, Welsh and English local government, then that would seem intuitively that would probably be an outcome of that to help support the rollout and implementation of the Armed Forces Covenant across the UK. But you've got to have that commitment and buy-in to do that. If you have, the point that's been made is about awareness of the Armed Forces Covenant. There is a lack of awareness of it. There's also sometimes misunderstandings of it, and you've got those expectations have got to be met or managed in respect of what exactly it is. And that's something that if it did go wider than this for the UK government or the devolved administrations, having that put that enshrined in legislation, there would be obviously have to manage expectations on that as well, and resources would have to be part of that.
I would just like to say that, yes, it needs a standardised structure. However, delivery must still retain at that local level because they know their communities, they know the demographics, etc. It's just the framework and the funding that comes along with it.
Thank you very much. Kelvin Bailey, please.
Okay, thank you, Chair. A lot of the issues that we received evidence about were as a result of the mobile nature of service life for both service personnel and for their families, the migratory nature of that role, but also the recognition that when you join the military, you leave a whole load of systems and fail to exist in some. And when you exit the military, there are problems and over those seams. And just to give you an example from some of the evidence that we've received, we received examples of dentistry and access to dental health, where service personnel talk about some having their families register at practices when they start their service career and continually driving them back to those places, taking leave and time off their own work or school just to maintain that care. With the NHS, we know that you just don't exist in there in the military, and we know that during the pandemic that was an issue with service people being able to access greater care, and then in other systems such as local authority systems, you just don't exist, and so your arrival is kind of like a hard arrival, like a migrant. What could be done to address these challenges?
Go first. I think one of the things that is really important is about the issues of the transition of serving to non-serving, but also about families and serving personnel who move around the country, probably proportionally more than any other employment element. One of the things that has been important in NHS England in working with that constant dilemma is setting up what we found was essential was the single point of contact. So we have a single point of contact service. It's quite small, but it is absolutely there to navigate individual families, individual personnel, and also veterans through sometimes the system of what that means when they're moving, and also what that means when the Armed Forces Covenant actually isn't understood. It's quite confusing whether that is something that is part of, if you like, generic services and generic element of how that is accessed, or whether that is particularly because you are at a disadvantage, because you are moving through the system. Dentistry is a really important one. It comes up a lot because, obviously, as you are aware, the Defence Medical Services provide the dentistry for serving and some, not all, but the majority of serving personnel. So this is quite a lot of difference. And there are a lot of pressures within the dentistry system and world within NHS dentists. And I think we've been trying to, alongside, obviously I know that my colleagues in the broader NHS have given further evidence around how we're supporting dentistry at the moment, but it is something about where, particularly for children of families, we've done a lot of work to make quite sure that if people do move around, they can have that consistent care, whether that's dentistry, whether that's also to do with learning disabilities, neurodiversity, so on and so forth. I think that's another big area.
The HCPs as well, which don't transition courses as well.
So I think this is something where I'm really welcoming this committee, because it is something where the Armed Forces Covenant can really kind of scrutinise and make that difference, because otherwise, if you don't have that, if you like, independent coordinator, talked about how that works in Wales or how that works within the single point of contact, then sometimes you find too late how that system can really help and support you. So I'll leave it there because I know there's other colleagues to bring that in.
Before I let you go, though, how do you think your work could be shared or used as good practice elsewhere?
Well, I think I was in a round table only yesterday as part of the 10-year plan engagement with veterans communities, with serving and with voluntary sector in Department of Health and with one of the ministers. What we were hearing there, that there was difference in different areas of the country, but there was also difference in devolved administrations. It goes both ways where that difference comes. And I think, it is incredibly frustrating for individuals to have to keep repeating that. So I think the digital element is really important. The work that we've done around the read codes and the digital accessibility for have you ever served, are you serving, are you a family member that's serving, is so important. We've got to be more proactive at asking the question and knowing that's a responsibility of the public sector and the independent sector and government departments. That's where we can do more, as well as building on when it really works and duplicating it pretty quickly.
Thanks, Kate. Mike, you're nodding a lot.
Yeah, thanks, Sister Bailey. Yes, some good points were made there, more sort of solutions focused. From a Scottish perspective, I would say, yeah, there's a lot of challenges for service families moving around, particularly from, say, England moving to Scotland. Differences and challenges, accessing services, caused by frequent relocations. I mentioned some of the kind of ways in local authority services in Scotland, like education, have service pupil advisors, and there's ambassadors in some of the local authorities, particularly in those authorities that have high populations of military service, armed force military service families. I think it's just understanding that all the challenges involved. For example, a family relocating to, say, Scotland, just the whole differences. The Scottish education system completely different, very, very different to the English system. Qualifications, curriculum, even the school holidays, if it feels and looks a lot different, can be quite disruptive for children moving around the country, and they need that sort of support that's in place. As I say, some of our local authorities have got that, but there's a lot of wider challenges in that, as well as employment, housing for people, families relocating, as well as mental health and wellbeing, and just having a whole package of services to help respond for these families and the challenges that they're encountering. I think Kate's mentioned maybe one or two there. It could be potential solutions. Have a more joined up approach right across the UK to support and assist that for families in those positions.
Thank you. I know in the past that our military medical provision used to be uniform and separate to the provision that was provided by the state, so that it didn't apply those pressures unduly. And I suppose, Liz and Gillian, that you would want similar kind of supplementing in being able to support local services or similar services and those pressures that come with migration.
Yeah, I mean, one of the challenges that we face, we hear on a regular basis, is the conflicting statutory regulations and the expectation and those priorities. And we've got the covenant duties, but also we have the priorities for people with disabilities, domestic abuse, special educational needs. So it becomes a conflict as to which one takes that priority, which can be a challenge. And we also have councils that find that the inconsistent policies between neighbouring authorities. So we try and deal with that by having the coordination and collaboration with neighbouring authorities, with schools, so we get that smoother transition for families. Some councils are providing digital resources. I think it was mentioned by my colleague here about digital. And we've got community ambassadors and dedicated armed forces officers that are supporting those families transitioning into an area. But there are consistent communication channels and the information sharing gaps, which I mentioned earlier, which can be a problem. That there needs to be some sort of system and network where there is greater access to that information.
Thank you, Liz.
Yes, it's helping people to find the relevant information is absolutely crucial. And as I said, we have the armed force liaison officers, and there was a review recently about whether or not they should be centralised, and the voice came back very strongly from local government to say they need to collaborate centrally, but actually they need to work on a local basis. So from whichever direction a member of the armed forces, families or veterans come into it, whether they go to their local British Legion, somebody else they've seen, they will be signposted in to that centralised source of support. The same thing happens in our local health boards, where all local health boards have a dedicated armed forces champion to advocate on behalf of the armed forces community. So what we try to do is to put a network of contacts so that wherever somebody accesses that network, they come back into the centre and are provided with the information that they need and the signposting that they need to get those services. We are in very challenging times resources wise, but we, with those sort of social and human capital links, we actually can provide those services quite cost effectively.
Thank you very much. Mike Martin, please.
Thanks, Chair. Yeah, just very briefly, and this is for Liz and Mike and Gillian, because it's about education and housing, so have a relaxed Kate. So we've obviously got these legal duties under the Covenant at the moment, and I was struck, Gillian, actually by your comment about how they conflict with other, well-meaning legal duties enshrined in other bits of legislation. And I suppose we have an opportunity to tidy up the law, so that's one thing we can do that. Is there any other support that local authorities should be or could receive from central government that would make the legal duties under the Covenant within education and housing better delivered and closer to what perhaps the people who wrote the Covenant envisaged? So is there more support that central government could give in those regards? Should we start with Liz?
I think that's a difficult one. I mean, as we were hearing earlier, the competing priorities. That said, anybody that comes in, their children will be placed as close as possible to where they're based. That goes without saying. We have one-stop shop support in terms of housing, and similarly, anybody that is at risk of being homeless particularly would go straight to the top of the list and be housed in an appropriate manner that could happen. Additional resources would make that much easier.
Okay, thanks. And then Mike.
Thank you. Because education and housing, I think we had a model when we worked with the MOD, we called it the firm-based model some years back, which it was felt that worked really well in respect of our regular liaison with armed forces representatives, with local authority professional associations and in ourselves at COSLA and other partners, some regular meetings. I think having some kind of support to assist local government, local authorities would be helpful. Also, perhaps some sort of form of supportive self-evaluation, not audit inspection, but something that actively helps local authorities to deliver it, along with resources for those communities, would potentially be of help and assistance too. I think when we look at housing, maybe give a context to that. In Scotland, we've declared, the Scottish Government's declared a housing emergency, and 13 of our 32 local authorities have declared a local housing emergency, so it's a real challenge for us. That said, every local authority provides housing, has it within allocations policy, specific stipulations about for veterans, about that's taken on board in respect of allocations, and a lot of work's done to obviously support and assist them. But it's a real challenge, though, Scotland, probably just like down here in London as well, but it's something that's quite tangible in respect of where we are with our homelessness figures and the number of people that are in temporary accommodation. So additional support would obviously be welcome to support and deliver for the housing side of things, as well as education. I'm aware just last week the Office for Veteran Affairs, they've recently put out a call for applications for funding for veterans, which that's obviously a helpful initiative, and those further initiatives like that can obviously help that achieve our common objective.
Very much.
Thank you. I mean, we need veteran-specific funding. It's not part of some of the funding programmes, for example, like the Health Inequalities Fund. It's not included as a separate ask. Councillors are asking for a dedicated funding for Armed Forces Covenant to ensure consistent service delivery. And that will reduce the volunteer reliance. We face challenges with the fluctuating local budgets, and I've identified what my own authority's financial situation is, and we are not unique. And it makes those longer-term planning decisions a lot harder. So we believe that having that stable funding would provide the security needed to maintain and continue supporting the services.
Thank you very much. Michelle Scroggin, please.
Thank you. So turning to health services, which is directed specifically to Kate, how can the government support those services, being more responsive to and aware of the needs of the armed forces personnel?
I mean, I think the awareness across England and obviously the UK is, and I'll repeat what others have said, is markedly better than it has been. And I think we've come a long way, and I think we need to build on that. Because actually I think you get a lot further when you're building on positives and good practice. What we can't afford is to go backwards, and we certainly can't afford not to grow even further. But I think I don't come from a military background. I know a lot of people that sit here often do. I mean, I do have obviously, and I've learned a lot about my family and my connections to do with the military doing this job for the last 14 years. But I'm passionate and professional about health inequalities, and I think what we've managed to do within the health element is look at how a unique pathway sometimes is misunderstood, and also where a unique pathway has predominantly very healthy, very capable men and women who are either in armed forces or become civilians and have to navigate that. But when they are poorly, they're often very poorly. Our prosthetics panel has been something that we've had to develop quite uniquely, as well as mental health services and what that means to do with different needs, particularly when it's complex related. But that's where you get really good practice and where you get some of those inconsistencies in health within your question, because there's quite often someone that thinks someone else is going to do it because it's an armed forces element. And too often someone thinks that the best thing to do is give somebody a leaflet from a charity. Now, it's great to have the armed forces charities as our partners and obviously separately. But ultimately, it is also a statutory duty for the public health system to understand and to work what that means as part of the armed forces community. So I think this look at the Armed Forces Covenant legislation is really helpful when in December 2022, employment, housing, going back to the last question, and also health came in on a stronger footing. That did help us focus across integrated care boards. But I think we need a more simplistic, user-friendly form for clinicians, for GPs, for healthcare services, for receptionists, for different angles of commissioning, but we also need it most importantly for patients and lived experience, because it is a requirement and it should be understood. And we often call it the 10th protected characteristic as part of the Equality Act 2010, and I think that I would really like to see that was something that was really built on as part of the good practice that's there. But otherwise we do get the patchy elements, which I know has been used a lot in this committee. And I think what's really important is that you do need, it's legislation, you do need statutory requirements that everyone needs to do within health, but you also need a local practice that develops it, that is really, really key, whether that's urban, semi-urban, rural, or different mechanisms.
Do you think expanding the covenant into social care would address some of the issues?
Yes, I do. I think it's a really important area, and I think it's essential. But I think it goes alongside the challenges that social care has per se. As someone who has lost my mother in the last year, who was part of that system, it was a struggle for her, and she wasn't a veteran. But what that means is, how do we make that absolutely key for people's individual experiences as well as the armed forces community?
Very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And just very briefly, in terms of the future of the Covenant, Should the covenant, in your view, be extended to central government and the devolved administrations? And are there any particular areas of service delivery which you think the covenant should be extended? If we start off with Mr. Callaghan.
It's a good question. I think first and foremost, we haven't got a political position on respect of should be expanded to the central government. But as I said in a previous response, it's something that, you know, arguably within it has a lot of potential intuitively in how it could enhance and provide more resources to the Armed Forces Covenant, and also provide better support for veterans. I think also there'd be potential for better intergovernmental coordination across the different spheres of government, and implementation would arguably, in principle, would likely to be better as well. And above all, I think a point that's mentioned as well is that awareness of the Armed Forces Covenant would seem to be greater if you had that wider commitment across different spheres of government. It's obviously an issue, and it's been mentioned already in our contributions, so that would be something that would potentially enhance it. But obviously, I say it's about managing expectations. You've got to support it with resources, and particularly when you go to a local level where it's delivered, as Councillor Ford said, to local communities.
Thank you very much. Ms Davies?
I think it can be strengthened, and I think it can be extended, and I would actually agree that I think government departments and the way that is understood is a really great opportunity. But I also think it's how people understand and use it better. And you know, you could liken it to something like safeguarding, which is a absolute, obviously, requirement. There is something about understanding when you need to use it, you need to use it, but when you don't need to use it, you still need to understand it. And I think those are the elements that are really important. I think, you know, Liz said it earlier, I think awareness and communication is absolutely essential. We've done a lot in branding the Armed Forces Covenant under the NHS, and that's really helped identifiable. So I think we can extend it, but I think actually what we can do is understand it better, communicate it better. Not so strategic and statutory, but more about what does that mean for you? What does that mean as part of clear and understood language? And maybe some of those case situations, the scenarios from reservists to communities to families of serving to veterans, and almost kind of break it down in the way that people will understand it, whether that was in housing or in health. And I think that would be incredibly helpful, as well as extension.
Thank you very much. Councillor Ford?
Thank you. Yes, councils agree about the expansion to social care and community services, particularly around mental health and supporting the elderly and disabled veterans. And as I said earlier, our North East London Integrated Care Board is signing up to this, so we're getting that health and social care and community base all working together. We're also looking at the Royal Star and Garter veteran-friendly framework to deliver within the care sector. So that is something that can expand and incorporate there. There are some caveats, however, that councils want any expansions to be evidence-based to ensure that they are aligned to the community needs and can be delivered sustainably. And it's avoiding that one-size-fits-all approach, which we've identified earlier. We recommend that there's flexibility in how the new duties are implemented at that local level to recognise the different priorities and demand pressures within those different localities.
Thank you very much. And lastly, Councillor Burnett.
I suppose in terms of extending the covenant, it is probably something that we would want to consult on as an organisation, although recognising the positives that can bring. And similarly, I'm not passing the buck here really, but it's perhaps not the role of the WLGA to comment on whether or not UK and government and Welsh government should be subject to the Armed Forces duty. However, I suppose that given the roles that they both play in providing leadership and setting national and strategic policy, which then has an impact on how local services operate, there would probably be merit in extending the duty in that way. I think in some ways, just to add in that you know, if you don't measure something, it tends not to happen. Mm-hmm. But if you're going to measure something, then we do need funding to make sure we've got a chance to actually achieve it.
Good. Well said. Well, look, thank you so much to all of your good selves for giving evidence at our hearing on the Armed Forces Covenant Inquiry. And with that, I bring this hearing to an end. Order.